Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this sun of York, and all the clouds that lord upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings. Our dreadful marches to delightful measures, grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front. And now, instead of mounting barbed seeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber, to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. This is Richard III, the opening statement in Shakespeare's play. After recording the trilogy, I felt like I had said much of what I wanted. And by trilogy, I mean the Mad King trilogy, the past 3 episodes. I talked a lot about leadership, the cost of weak men, and how to prepare a future as a recovery from the past. And those 3 episodes represented a really major era of my life. The past and how I reconciled it. And it was really an honor to be able to share, and I hope help others through a journey that they might be going through, whether it's more direct or indirect. But it really felt like I had put a pin on this journey from Canada to Sweden and back to Canada again. But in the intervening weeks since my last episode, I realized that much like in that opening reading, that I had maybe entered into a sudden winter of discontent, and perhaps my future was being called into question. Welcome to the Sons of Men podcast, a conversation dedicated to meaning in the lives of men, offering a window into the life and trials of masculinity, where we talk about family, spirituality, creativity, and legacy to better understand each other and to offer solutions for the next generation of young men striving for a better future. I'm your host, Curtis Wiebe, a father and husband, addict in lifelong recovery, and an advocate for men seeking to transform their lives and through strength change the world outside their window. This is episode 19, A Great Longing for Home. After those episodes, I was remembering a lot about my time in Stockholm, and I think it's pretty obvious by now that I have a love for that city. Really, Stockholm is where I found my heart. And there are a lot of things that led to that. I've talked about that a lot as well. But I want to more precisely talk about Stockholm as a city. And it's going to tie into the topic today, which is this idea of discontent versus discomfort. So I don't want to get into the details of that yet. I want to set up the paradigm which I am going through right now so that you can better understand maybe what I'm getting to here. Stockholm to me represented some key things, some key values that are irrevocably placed in my heart. And for better or worse, it's a simple truth. I've joked with some of my Swedish friends about how having lived in Stockholm has kind of doomed or cursed me for the rest of my life, because I know what a great city is capable of being. In Stockholm, it has this quiet beauty. This is a trait that I don't know how to describe to people. You know, if you've lived in a city that you love, it's really hard to describe what it feels like. It's very much an art thing, as well. How does art make you feel? Well, Stockholm had quiet beauty. It was clean. We lived in a neighborhood that was so close to nature that 5-minute walk, you were in the forest. But you were still close enough that you could get into the city within a 5 to 10 minute walk. That's a key point, which is going to be brought up later. The idea that I could walk everywhere in the city that I lived in. And the architecture is beautiful. It is a city that survived World War II and was left pretty much untouched. And so it has this rich history. And it has this beautiful mix of commercial and residential. So town squares have people who live there, but there's also small businesses that administer to the local population. And, well, you'll understand why that's important in a moment. In Stockholm, I also met people that, well, ultimately became friends with deep and rich bonds. They challenged me to be a better person. Again, I've talked about those friends quite often on here. But also a maturity that I think, again, is kind of hard to describe, but you could talk about life at the station that we were in, mid 40s, we had a child, all kind of going through this season of change, I suppose. And we would talk about those things quite real and quite upfront. And eventually those conversations would steer into philosophy or, deeper meaning. And those friendships were very comfortable. Even if there were rocky times or even if there were challenges being thrown down, there was a comfort that I had never experienced before. And maybe that was just partially due to the changes that I was going through, but looking back, I didn't realize how natural that all felt. And finally, there was community and culture. I touched on this about the history, but what was really interesting about Stockholm and the neighborhood that we lived in, which I'd never experienced, was everyone in our apartment building would contribute to the maintenance of the grounds, and they would do every few months a yard cleanup, and pretty much everyone would throw in, put in their time as we care for our building and we care about our neighbors. We became good friends with our neighbors in the building, and some of them were older, and we got to know about the Swedish culture from the older generation, which was really interesting. And through that, I better understood the Swedish culture in general, the difference of how the seniors versus my age versus the younger generation see their country. But there was also this spirit of history. The ancients used to talk about a city having a spirit as an actual entity that permeated the culture or the buildings, the ground upon which the city was built, that it lived inside of the city. And I really felt that in Stockholm. There was a rich history there, a rich culture. It was really nice to be able to hear a different language being spoken around me all the time. And it was so connected to the way of life of the Swedish people. A quieter, I would say almost gentler way of speaking and acting. Those two things were very tightly woven together. But Stockholm, there were some realities for us there. I never really felt Swedish, and that obviously makes sense because I wasn't. I knew that if we had lived there long term, I never would have fully integrated. And that just comes as being an immigrant. I have a lot of compassion and love for immigrants, having gone through it myself, and the difficulties that you face as someone leaving your home country to try to make a way in a new one. But that was true. Even if we had fully picked up the language, we weren't raised with that culture. Now, a quick aside, we have realized in the intervening months that we have been in Canada that our daughter actually is Swedish culturally. And this has caused us to do some deep thinking, which I'm going to cover in a moment. The other reality was running a startup was very difficult there. Taking risks is hard in Sweden because the cost of living, well, not the cost of living per se, but the high taxes and, well, there aren't a lot of systems in place to kind of encourage startup culture unless you already have a lot of money. But anyway, those are some realities we were dealing with in Stockholm. And eventually especially the startup, which failed, brought us back to Canada. And that is, I think, where the winter of discontent began for me and my family. So let's talk a little bit about Vancouver. Why did we return to Vancouver? Well, we had a history here. That's where my wife and I met. That's where our daughter was born. And we lived here for a few years. And I have talked about this in a previous episode. I'm just going to get a little bit more detailed here. I think the previous episode where I mentioned this might have been the early signs that we were struggling to make Vancouver home. Even though we had old roots here, we were and are finding it difficult to find a community. And I think in reflection, we've been feeling that the city has changed. But like I said, knowing what a city could be after having lived in Stockholm, I think it really is. We have changed and I have changed. That is for certain. And don't get me wrong, we have really great friends here in Vancouver and we enjoy them immensely, the time that we get together. But outside of that, there's something in our hearts that has been left wanting. And I felt something strange that I hadn't for a long time. Discomfort. And what is that discomfort rooted in? Well, I've been reflecting on that. Me and my wife have been talking about this now for the last few months. And if you've been to Vancouver, again, this isn't just going to be me slamming the city. I just need to point out how it doesn't align with what we value. And yes, there's definitely some beauty here, but for us, and as a way to kind of expose why we're feeling the way we're feeling. One of the things that is pretty obvious in Vancouver to me is that greed is God here. I mean, if you've seen the cost of living here, not just in the real estate, but in the rental market, people are out to make as much money as possible with doing as little as possible. It leads to this feeling of kind of cheapness almost everywhere. We're driving everywhere as well. We're living life in a car in transit. We don't walk like we used to. We did a trip recently, and I'm going to talk about that at the end of this, but in that trip, we went to a very walkable city. And in 5 days, I walked 40 kilometers. And I looked at my Google map, basically, which tells me how much I've been walking, Google Fit. I hadn't done that much walking in 3 months in Vancouver. And even that I was a bit baffled by. I didn't recognize how I even had walked that much given how we drove everywhere. But then I realized that all those walking kilometers that were registered were in mega big box stores like Walmart or Superstore to buy groceries. That's where I was walking. How depressing. I also have this sense that individualism, that community I talked about, we found in Stockholm, nobody really cares about their neighbor here, or at least we haven't experienced it. There's trash in the yards, and my wife actually saw someone walking down the street and they threw their garbage just on somebody's lawn. And that in Stockholm would be unfathomable. You would not do that just from the great cultural shame that would be visited upon you. We can talk about the mountains. It is beautiful, but I kind of call it distant nature. You can see it in the background, but it costs money to be able to go up. If you want to go skiing, or you have to just drive there. It's not accessible. It takes a real effort to get out there. It's not immediately in our surroundings. And I think that kind of is tied in for me to this death of culture. In my neighborhood in particular, there are these old style buildings called the Vancouver Specials, and they're pretty iconic style of building. You can look it up. They have a very unique look to them. And in this neighborhood in particular, we are seeing signs everywhere of land assemblies, whole blocks being sold part and parcel, in which case they knock every single one of those buildings down and they build cheap and as ugly apartment complexes as they can to make as much profit out of it as possible, with spending as little money as possible. And imagine that on a grand scale. even some of the buildings, these really beautiful 1920s and 30s houses that have real, I would say, spirit to them, are being leveled by the block to put up these either new houses, which, house 5 or 6 people, or apartment buildings. And I've made the joke that if developers in Vancouver could blast the mountains to pieces so they could make money off buildings there, they would absolutely do it. And that's just the feeling of this city. That's how it feels. That's the feeling of Vancouver. All of this said, we have been feeling that the hearth of our home that we had established in Stockholm is broken. When I think about our apartment in Stockholm, it was tiny. It was 530 square feet, a 3-person family. But I would take that every day of the week over a bigger place that we have here. We had established what was a cozy life. It was comfortable. And I've been longing for that feeling of warmth and closeness and a sense of place. So we visited Montreal. And I think the reality is that our hearts are longing for a taste or something close to the life that we had in Stockholm. We're never going to fully get it back. I realize that. But there are some real key issues, a misalignment of our values in the place that we live. For us, Montreal represented a potential home of history and culture and community. Montreal is a little bit like us. When we moved to Sweden, we loved it and we made friends, but we weren't quite Swedish. We weren't quite European. And now that we've come back, our sensibilities have been sharpened or changed. So we're not quite Canadian either. And I feel that is a little bit Montreal. It's not quite Canadian if you know enough about the history of Quebec and Montreal in particular. Not quite Canadian. It is, but not quite. But it's also not quite European because it's still Canadian. And I feel, interestingly, where they value art and their history, they fight for their culture and language, I can get behind that. So, we'll see. But what is this about? This is really about recognizing the difference between discontent and discomfort. I had a call with a friend who I've mentioned numerous times in the podcast, my friend Riley, who knew of our frequent moves, and he asked me a serious and valid question when I told him that, yes, we were considering moving to Montreal, another move, right? And he said, will you ever be content in one place? And I think, given our history, that is definitely worth investigating. It's a totally valid question. Are we making this decision out of emotion or frustration or fear? Or is this simply a winter of discontent or something more? Now, I believe life requires discontent. It drives us towards our purpose and towards meaningful action. And there is value in satisfaction, but we can always grow, I think, and be more charitable, more compassionate, become stronger. We can always refine ourselves, and saying, I'm good where I am, I think can lead to stasis. So I thought about it, and I believe I answered genuinely that yes, I can be content. And I was in Stockholm. That life was cozy, and I can see the loss of it, sadly, not just in my own life, but in my wife and my daughter. We are struggling here emotionally and spiritually. And for all the things we miss in the city, we still call home in our hearts, Stockholm. We can find something close to it in a place where our values are elevated above money and profit, which it feels like to be the case here where we live now. If you're struggling, it's important to question your heart. Is this a temporary setback or suffering, or has this been a long time strain in your life? Some of this ties into the trilogy of Mad Kings, weirdly. Working for one is likely a discomfort. It is not a situation of season that will change. And maybe it's time to be honest with yourself about where you work, who you work for. Or maybe you're struggling in your relationship and you haven't had the courage to speak your heart. Recognizing the difference between discomfort and discontent is critical. Let me give an example. It's the difference between toughing out a difficult season or going to a counselor in pursuit of healing, of living in a space that darkens your grasp of the future. Vancouver, sorry. Or taking a risk and pursuing new lands of opportunity, of emotional or fearful reaction or logical and rational decision making. Whatever you may be struggling with, wrestle with it and be honest with yourself. Find the courage to come to truth and, with full clarity, better understand the winter of your discontent. I think the break that I took in the podcast was mainly because this is something that we're struggling with, and we are looking for answers to find this happy medium. We're not trying to be overly critical or miserable for the sake of it. We are genuinely asking ourselves, what did we lose? And I have to be honest, I'm still struggling spiritually to understand why I had to leave Stockholm. I mean, there are some pretty obvious signs about what I'm trying to pursue, but why would I have to leave a place I loved with friends I loved deeply to start over again in the middle of my 40s? I'm sorry, as you can hear, there's a dog downstairs. Winter of discontent. I wanted to record this episode because it's a transitionary time for us, and being transparent about it. I'm still struggling with the difference between discomfort and discontent. And maybe I haven't defined it as clearly as I should have, but that's pretty much where I am currently anyway, is discovering the difference between the two. We are looking at this transition potentially this year, and we have a few months to figure things out. I mean, there are a lot of other factors, of course. I still haven't been able to find any work. It is really rough out there, and we have to find a way to cut our costs. Montreal is significantly cheaper to live. So there are a lot of factors going into it, but it's been interesting recognizing what we lost and how hard it is to maintain the integrity of a heart once you're far from the source that inspired it. I haven't given up hope. I still feel very grateful for everything in my life, even though I miss Stockholm and everything there immensely. I'm still grateful that we are healthy and that we have a future ahead of us, wherever that might be. I still have gratitude. And I think that is a great sign that this is discomfort, because I haven't given up hope. And in your observation about your own life, I hope that you feel the same. An optimism in this season that things can turn. And if not, if this is something that is ongoing long in your life, that you can find some good solutions to make a change that maybe has been a long time in the coming. And as you figure it out, I'll be doing the same. And until then, God bless.